Greg Peterson here, and I want to thank you for listening to the Urban Farm Podcast. We wouldn't be able to keep doing these great shows without you. So as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you access to a list of our top 10 episodes I personally find most inspiring. If you enjoy the Urban Farm Podcast but don't have time to listen to every one, then you will love this list. Although all our guests have great information to offer, if you are short on time, these 10 are must-listens. To get access to the top 10 most inspiring podcast episodes, text FARMER to 44222. That's FARMER to 44222. And enjoy listening.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the grow your own food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Matthew Shepard of the Xerces Society to talk about his experience with essential pollinators. Matthew's career began in England, where he established a successful community-based conservation program in Essex and helped to create Samfire Hoe, an award-winning nature park. He has also worked with local communities and government agencies in Kenya to improve the management of the Arabuko-Sokoke Forest on the north coast of Mombasa. He has created and maintained gardens that provide for insects and other wildlife everywhere he has lived, a passion that began when he learned gardening at his mother's side. Matthew's introduction to pollinator conservation actually came 2 decades ago on a sunny hillside in southern England. While he worked on a project to protect disappearing grasslands, he was manually using an artist's paintbrush to transfer pollen between endangered orchids and realized there was obviously something missing in that ecosystem. You think? 5 years later, after marrying an American and moving to Oregon, Matthew was working for the Xerces Society at the vanguard of a new effort to protect pollinators. In the past 15 years, he has collaborated with people from all walks of life to promote awareness about and protection of pollinator insects, especially native bees. Matthew is the author of numerous articles and other publications, including Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening for Butterflies. He is now the Society's communication director, reducing the amount of time he spends with pollinators, but increasing the time supporting many of the other aspects of their conservation work. Matthew is here to chat about the book, 100 Plants to Feed Bees, published by Story Press. Welcome to the show today, Matthew.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here.
Great to have you. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, where I am now, I didn't at all know that I was going to end up here. I've never been one of those people who could sit down and draw out a plan, say 5 years from now I'll be here and 10 years I'll be here. I've just managed to put together a career that I love and have just taken the opportunities when they came along. Although I now work for an organization that focuses on insects and has a very strong base in entomology, the study and science of insects, my own academic background is utterly unrelated, and I came through studying geography as an undergraduate.
Oh, interesting.
So that connected my love of trying to understand how people influence the landscape and the environment, and that's the underlying theme that runs through so much of what I've done since.
Mm-hmm. So, how do people impact the environment around us?
Oh, in so many different ways. And with my background, when I was studying geography, you can follow it all the way back through the centuries. I'm from Britain, been living here in the United States for 17 or 18 years now. But in my home country, you can look at the landscape and you can see the influence of the farming activities or the transportation networks, and go all the way back to the Iron Age, basically. So you can go back 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years and see how people have changed the landscape and influenced everything around them.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing here. I live on the west coast of the United States, and an old building here is 80 years old. I would expect an old building in Europe to be, 800 years old?
Sometimes older. Yeah. No, years ago, I had the good fortune to travel to Egypt, and I stood there in a stone building that was reckoned to be 2.5 millennia old, and maybe one of the first stone buildings that ever been constructed. So there's some remarkable structures. Yeah,
I like to call that that's more on the line of geologic time than it is people time. Because we humans think in 80-year swaths of time, whereas
something like that. Yeah.
Whereas nature thinks in millennia, which it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, and if you look at us, we're just a little dot on the end of the line of time. So.
Yeah, exactly. So for those listeners who are not familiar with the Xerces Society, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, the Xerces Society is a non-profit conservation organization, and the focus of our work is upon insects and other invertebrates. And for those of you listeners who don't know, an invertebrate is an animal that lacks a backbone. So it could be a bee, a butterfly, a dragonfly, earthworms, slugs, snails, all the tiny little things, the things that we often dismiss as being creepy crawlers or pests, the ones that we swat away when we see them. But as E.O. Wilson so memorably and accurately described them, they are the little things that run the world. And they are it's fantastic. It really sums them up beautifully, because they are at the center of so much of our life, basically.
Yeah.
They underpin our food supply. They keep our environment clean. They maintain the health of our rivers and creeks. They make the landscapes around us beautiful. They help define the seasons. We're also on the west coast in northwest Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, and you look here, and in the springtime, the roadsides and the prairies are in bloom. In the summer, we go out and we pick our strawberries and raspberries and blueberries, and in the fall, we go to the pumpkin patch and we decorate our houses with pumpkins, and that's what all of those things revolve around or are dependent upon insects.
Yeah. Do you know any startling facts about insects?
No, I could probably bore your listeners forever on startling facts. Just the sheer diversity and the sheer numbers of them. We often find that when you go and talk to someone about insects, maybe they got used to the number of birds, and they're going, we've got 100 birds, different species of birds living here. And we suddenly say, well, you've got about 1,000 species of insects living here as well.
Wow.
And so that sometimes that can be just simply mind-blowing.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did this Xerces Society begin?
We just celebrated our 45th birthday.
Wow.
A week or so back.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Robert Michael Pyle, who's a butterfly scientist and an author and a speaker, back in 1971, he was studying in Britain, where so much of the early work on butterfly conservation had been done. And so he was there spending a year with these great inspirational scientists. And while he was there was a butterfly called the large blue butterfly that had been becoming rarer and rarer in Britain, and it was just on the verge of extinction. And he went to a lecture one evening and talking about this butterfly. And on his way home, he was like, this should not happen. There should be someone to speak out to protect these butterflies and to stop this from happening again. And that was his inspiration. And that was the December the 9th of 1971 was when he launched that idea and started recruiting supporters to help him.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. So we've got quite a good heritage.
Yeah, no kidding. What does the word mean?
The Xerces blue was a butterfly.
Ah.
It was the It used to fly in the San Francisco Peninsula area on the coastal sand dunes there, and it was last seen alive in 1943, and it's one of the first butterflies known to go extinct in North America because of human activity.
Yeah.
And so that was Bob's inspiration for the name, and the underlying mission is we're here to try and stop more butterflies and other insects from going extinct.
So why are these insects so important to us?
Well, they run the world. I mean, we could lose elephants, we could lose deer, we could lose all the big fluffy feathered creatures, and on the whole, the planet would just keep rolling along nicely. But you lose the insects, and you'll find yourself knee deep in detritus that won't rot away. You'll find yourself without a huge variety of foods that bring such diversity and nutrition to our diet.
Yeah.
The other wildlife would not have the food either. So they're just hugely important.
Perfect. So what programs are current priorities for the Society right now?
We have a major program looking at pollinator conservation. Obviously, the pollinators are something that have been in the news quite considerably for the last 10 or maybe 15 years, ever since the early reports of CCD, the colony collapse disorder, affecting honeybees came forward. But we had actually become involved with pollinator conservation back in the mid-1990s, in the early days of the Forgotten Pollinators campaign, when the first groups were going, well, hold up, we're beginning to have evidence of disappearing bees, and we're not just talking about honeybees here, we're talking about the 3,600 species of native bees in North America. And so we have a major program now with, I would say, 15 staff working on it.
Wow.
Scattered around the country. Yeah, it's a great program. We've been able to take a leading role in promoting pollinator conservation. We train farmers, we train land managers, we work with gardeners to provide them with the information and knowledge to actually be able to take action themselves. We also have an active endangered species program, which is, there's a lot of overlap between these programs inevitably, because some of the endangered species we've been working to protect are bees, so there's a major overlap there. In fact, just a couple of months ago, we had 7 yellow-faced bees in Hawaii were added to the Endangered Species Act and officially protected, and they were the first bees to ever be federally protected by the Endangered Species Act. So that was quite a step forward. And there's a couple of bumblebees in the continental United States that are one of them's being proposed to be added to the Endangered Species Act and being officially protected. So there are these various really increasingly rare species that need the protection.
Yeah.
Our endangered species program also works a lot on rare butterflies. We do a lot of work doing surveys for strange and obscure and little-known species, whether it's a slug or a snail or beetles. We do all sorts of things. Yeah. And now a major part of our work has been focusing on the monarch butterfly.
Oh, good.
So we're doing a lot of work in California with the overwintering sites for the monarchs in California, and also a lot of work across the country in promoting milkweed planting and protection, and making sure there's enough habitat for these butterflies, because if they're going to spread out across millions of square miles of the continent, they need to have the right plants there to support them. Yeah,
exactly. Wow, I am so glad you all are out there doing this work, because it's such an important piece of our ecosystem.
Yeah, and I would say that the one part that I hadn't mentioned so far is our pesticides program, which again kind of overlays over everything else because pesticides are everywhere.
Yeah.
But we've been played a large part in many of the conversations and discussions about one particular group of insecticides called neonicotinoids, and finding ways to limit the use of those and to push the agencies to go back and review and rethink whether these should in fact be considered safe enough for use. So we have fingers everywhere, really.
Nice. You've mentioned bees a couple of times, and I would say that that most of our listeners are very familiar with the honeybee, but there are a whole lot more bees out there that are more in the native category that we don't even know about. So can you tell us about the native bees and why they're so important to the ecosystems?
Oh, God.
I know.
Pollinators, yeah, I know. I was like, whoa, where do I start? Pollinators as a whole are just profoundly important. Something like 80% or more of our flowering plant species require an insect to move the pollen from flower to flower, and from doing that to make sure that there will then be seed for the next generation or the fruit. And so that gives us something like 1 out of every 3 mouthfuls of food that we consume, and a lot of other products. Cotton is another product that we make a lot of get a lot of benefit from. That's pollinated by an insect. And of all the pollinators out there, certainly in North America, bees are considered to be the most important single group of pollinators. And so there are the honeybees, and honeybees are profoundly important to our agriculture. There's no other bee that can be so easily moved around, that can be so easily managed, can be brought in, put into a field for the 2 or 3 weeks you need it there, while the crop's flowering and moving on. But honeybees are originally a European species. They originally were brought to the United States with the early colonists because honey was one of the very few sources of sugar. And we all need sugar for sweetening and for brewing beer and alcohol. And there's so many other uses. Even the beeswax was hugely important. At one point, beeswax was worth more than gold just on the market. So, honeybees are profoundly important, but there are something like 3,600 species of other bees in the United States and Canada, and these include bumblebees and mason bees and sweat bees and yellow-faced bees and polyester bees and longhorn bees and digger bees and mining bees, and they go on and on and on.
Wow.
And most of them look unlike anything you think a bee should look like because they're not necessarily striped. They're different colors. They don't carry. I mean, people imagine a bee carrying that big lump of pollen on its back leg, just like the honeybee.
Right.
But most of the bees don't carry it like that. So they don't fit that image that we might have of what a bee looks like. So we just don't notice them.
Cool. And they're just here because I know we have mason bees here, but we don't see them very often. So these are insects that are just in our space, and we may not even know what they are to look at them.
No, that's right. But I mean, we do share the space with them, and going back to my early comments about people changing and influencing the environment, we are changing the landscapes around us. I mean, I can look out of my window and I see houses and I see gardens, but some of the gardens are just mown grass, and so there's nothing there for a bee, for example. So some of these bees are able to survive around us, but others are just kind of being pushed out of the way and pushed to the margins of the places we live. Yeah.
And it's really important. I got an email recently from somebody that said, hey, I've got this bug in my yard. How do I kill it? And when I reached back out to her and I said, do you have a picture of it? And she actually had a picture of it. And it was actually an assassin bug, which is a beneficial bug in our yard. So it's really important for everybody to find out what it is, before the first thing you do is to go out and kill it.
Yeah, no, we often say that if you have a garden, if there's no signs of insect damage, then you've probably got an unhealthy garden.
Right, exactly.
Because a healthy garden should have the full community of insects.
Yeah.
Whether they're pollinators or assassin bugs eating things or wasps that are catching and paralyzing other insects and taking it back to the nest to feed their young, or there's so many different ways in which insects work to keep our environment in balance.
Yeah.
And if you don't have them, then your patch is out of balance.
Yeah, I like that. Your patch is out of balance. I like that. So about a month ago, I got this amazing book from our friends over at Story Publishing called 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. And it's by the Xerces Society. And I immediately got on the phone with them and I said, oh my gosh, we need somebody on the show to talk about this book. So hence you're here, and thank you so much for being here for that. So 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, that title is great because it explains exactly what the book is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some introductory information in the book explaining what bees are and how they interact with plants and so on. But the core of the book is profiles and information about 100 plants that will be great for bees.
Yeah.
When people start thinking about what they've heard about bee declines and they want to do something, and they come to us and they say, wow, what can I do? And there's lots of things you can do. Mm-hmm. You can reduce pesticides, and you can make sure you've got nesting sites and other things like that. But the core of what you need to have the food for them. And if you don't have the right kind of plants, then you're not going to be supporting the bees. And so the simplest thing that anybody can start doing to help bees is to start growing plants, growing the flowers that the bees can feed on, and then they'll find them, and then they'll be doing better.
Yeah. But
for many people, you go to a garden center and you say, well, which plant do I need for bees? And you look at the plants and you go, oh, well, that's a pretty plant.
Uh-huh.
But just because we find it attractive doesn't mean that a bee will find it attractive.
Yeah.
And so in this book, we want to try and make it as simple as possible, because you're faced with plant lists and information from so many different sources. And we just want to but focus in on the key things. And, if you can get as many of these different plants growing in your patch, then you're going to have a fantastic area for bees.
Yeah.
And a fantastic area for plants too.
So what's one of your favorite plants in this book?
Oh, I've always loved asters. They're beautiful, and they support a very wide range of insects, more than just bees. I mean, they're great for bees for sure, but there are other insects that will come to them. Mm-hmm. And they flower late in the summer, so they come out at a time when it's almost like, for most people, your garden is beginning to fade. It's beginning to look a bit weary and tired after the summer.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, in the late summer into the fall, these asters start popping up, and they just fill a gap and extend on through the season. Nice.
So I turned to page 28 in the book, 100 Plants to Feed mm-hmm. the Bees, and that's where the aster's at. And I just want to kind of review what's here, because this is great information. First of all, it calls out the name of it, plus the botanical name of it. And then on the left below that are pictures of the different pollinators that it attracts, which is really cool. And then on the next page, the facing page, the uses of it. And one of my favorite pieces is a map where they will grow. So you guys have put a lot of information into this book. Can you tell me how it came about?
Wow. Well, it was trying to answer that question that so many people were coming to us. They would say, "What can I do?" And we already had plant lists, and we had some other books on, how to attract native pollinators, or if you're gardening for butterflies, what you can do. But we realized that so many of these things were regional, and so we wanted to try and produce a single resource that would be useful for people wherever they lived in the United States and Canada. And that's why there's that map. On the aster page that we're talking about, the map probably shows them growing everywhere, because
it does.
They will, but there are a lot of different species. And so even though this book covers the entire extent of continental US and Canada, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's one species that will suit the entire area. And so you will have to look a little more closely to try and find the species for your region.
Yeah.
Because the local native plants, without a doubt, the best type of flowers to plant for bees. Gordon Franke, who is based in University of California in Berkeley, has spent several years now. It started as a small project and it just kept growing because it was such a remarkable finding. But he went around and he looked in suburban urban gardens, identified all the flowers that were growing in these gardens, and identified all the bees that were visiting the different flowers. And what he was able to show from the huge database was that native flowers supported not just more individual bees, but a greater diversity of species. And so, that underscores the importance of native plants. So anytime someone's out there wanting to do something and find the plants, they should always try and find the plants that are native to the area they live in.
Yeah. And one of the cool things on page 29 of the book, it talks about recommended species or varieties for particular areas. So it gives that data as well.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
so we try to provide some of that information too, but there may well be other species that it's one relatively small book and it's not going to be a totally comprehensive encyclopedia.
Yeah.
But we also didn't want to overwhelm people with information because sometimes that is also just too much.
Well, plus this book has amazing photographs in it, hundreds of them, which is just wonderful. So really beautiful, beautiful book here.
Cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Yeah, these are always the times that are tricky, going, well, what was a failure? But I mean, I can certainly look back to times when I've been managing sites for wildlife. My own background, I mean, I talked initially about my geography, but I moved from college into hands-on conservation work and spent quite a few years working directly with landowners and farmers and others to plant hedgerows and create new woodlands and plant meadows and such like. And I can look back and remember times when there was one time we had a meadow that I was helping someone manage, which had a lot of ant mounds on it. And so there was the people didn't realize the ant mounds were there initially, and so we went in and we looked and we started talking to them about what would be the best way of managing this site. And their first reaction was to send a tractor in with a mower because they wanted to keep the grass short.
Yeah.
But they also kept a lot of these ant mounds short as well. So it started as a conversation of how can we manage this land, and it turned into a conversation about, oops, that was the wrong thing to do. And in this respect, my failure was that we'd raised the profile of this site, and until then, the ant mounds hadn't been wonderful, but at least they hadn't been smashed.
Yeah.
And so then we had to turn the conversation around with the landowner to say, okay, so that tractor did not work very well. What can we do to this site? And it took a few more years until we were able to shift that action around and to gradually get the machinery smaller and smaller. And eventually we ended up with cattle on the site. We were able to find a way in which we could bring some cows in just for a few weeks each year. Had to put the right kind of fencing up and find a supply of cows. And this was in southern England, in an area where there really weren't many animals. It was mostly an arable farming area. And so we had to go some distance to find the livestock, but we're able to bring them in. And then once we'd done that, and then you could begin to see the wildflowers beginning to return, because the cows, instead of, unlike a mower that just comes through and chops everything short, the cows are much more selective. And then you could begin to see the grassland beginning to develop and recover its wildflower diversity. And also you could see the plants on the ant mound. The ants begin to rebuild their mound. And the plants growing on the ant mounds are different from the ones growing in the flat areas around.
Oh, interesting. Of course that would be the case.
Yeah, because the soil is warmer and drier,
Yeah.
and better drained, and has a different texture.
Mm-hmm.
And then we finally, the reason for wanting to manage that site is because it was one of the last sites in that area that supported a particular type of blue butterfly.
Mm.
And through all of this, that had been our aim, was to encourage the butterflies and to build the population of butterflies. And I'm very pleased to say that after about 4 years, we began to see the number of butterflies rising again. So
nice.
Something that came out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this is our best way to learn, is to, jump in, do a project, and, oops, you make a mistake, but got to find the bonus in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you consider your biggest success?
When you were reading my bio, you mentioned that I'd worked in Kenya.
Yes.
And Arabuko-Sokoke Forest. And that was a funny situation, because I went there as a volunteer through a British organization called Volunteer Service Overseas, it's kind of the equivalent of the Peace Corps here in the United States.
Right.
So you go in and you work closely with the local communities. And I'd gone there expecting to be the junior member of a team of 3 people working to promote sustainable management of the forest and to build ecotourism and tourist facilities and encourage development of tourism to the forest as a way of supporting and bringing a new income to the villages around the forest. And the week before I arrived in Kenya, the funding for that project was cut.
Mm.
And so I turned up, instead of being, as I say, the junior member of a team of 3, I was the team, and I didn't have any budget, and I was in a new country,
Yeah.
barely spoke the language. We just kind of, they said, well, here you are, here's a laptop computer, which was remarkable, because this was back in the 1990s.
Oh, wow.
Computers were not that common. So
Oh, yeah.
given a laptop computer in Kenya, of all places, was weird. And so they said, here's a laptop computer, here's a motorbike. Now go down there and see what you can do. And so I just had to go down and try and make something out of nothing. And of course I arrived, and the expectation was very high from the Kenya Wildlife Service.
Oh, of course.
And the forestry department and the other people down there, because they for a year or more, they've been told all this money would be coming and there'd be all these great projects, and then they get me. So we had to rebuild relationships with the people down there. We had to find new ways of trying to work towards some of the sustainable development aims that everyone had been talking about. I had to go out and meet with the local village chiefs and the local companies and all of that going on, and trying to build something new and keep it going. And I was there for 2 years, and I'm very happy to say at the end of 2 years we had got the beginnings of a group of tourist guides who we'd been training in ornithology and bird watching and education and outreach techniques, better ways to present the information, because this forest had some bird species which occurred nowhere else in the world. They were endemic to the forest.
Wow.
And so we already had this in with tourists who just bird watch. I mean, the crazy, intense bird watchers who just want to check these species off for their world list. But also 5 miles away, the beaches of the Indian Ocean, and the tourists who were just lying there getting the sunburn, who wanted to do something different. Let's take a 3-hour excursion into that forest.
Right.
So we've begun to build the basic infrastructure to enable that to happen. And then I left, and they actually sent someone else in to keep the work going. So the fact that they felt that there was enough there to continue supporting it and to have someone else to take it on and move it to the next stage was just great.
Yeah. Excellent. Good job. So I'm all about education, and I have to know, is there a book that has been influential in this process in your life that you can share?
Yeah, and it's a really old book because I'm pretty old myself now. I credit Jonathan Porritt, who was the leader of Friends of the Earth in Britain back in the 1980s, as the person who really inspired me to take, my geography and whatever else and turn it into a conservation career. Because back then there really wasn't that much going on in conservation. It wasn't really seen as a realistic option.
Mm-hmm.
And so he produced the book Seeing Green, which I guess was published way back in the mid-1980s. I can't remember now. But it was, for me, it was an eye-opener because it really began to explain how people were impacting things and begins to explain things in a way that understand the politics of it and beginning to set concern for the environment and conservation within terms that society can understand. And that's, he was the person that through Friends of the Earth, I started volunteering, the local Friends of the Earth group where I was living in England at the time. And that was, in many ways, the spark that got me going into where I am now.
Wow. And this is, by the way, this is exactly the reason I like asking this question, is because this book changed your life forever. By the way, it came out in 1984. Seeing Green, The Politics of Ecology Explained by Jonathan Porritt. It'll be in the show notes today, guys, if you want to look it up. It looks like an amazing book. I'm going to get me a copy.
I suspect it may be out of print now, but there may be a few secondhand copies floating around.
I'll tell you.
I have my own personal copy right here in my hand.
Oh, nice. Yeah, the book Ishmael by Daniel Quinn lives that way with me. So, but I'm on on our favorite rainforest site out here looking at it, and there are plenty of copies of this book, Seeing Green: The Politics of Ecology Explained. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
I never give up.
Yeah.
That happens at the moment. There's a lot of people feeling not very happy about what's happening in the national politics and feeling that there's some changes afoot that they may not like.
Yeah.
That's the nature of a democracy. Sometimes you like it, sometimes you don't. But never give up. You always have to retain and remember what's important to you. You have to keep hold of the things that are at the core of who you are, and you have to keep working to move things in the direction you want to see them go. Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Matthew. It has been a treat getting to chat with you. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed it too. Absolutely.
So how can our listeners find out about the Xerces Society and get a hold of you maybe?
Yeah, well, if you go for our website, which is xerces.org, which I'll spell that Xerces.org, and you'll find just a huge amount of information there, or information about our different programs, information about what you can do, downloadable fact sheets, all sorts of things like that. And you'll also find a staff directory with contacts for everybody.
Beautiful.
I can give out my email address if people want, but you go there and you'll just find it. But it's matthew.shepard@xerces.org.
Perfect. Spell Xerces again for us.
Xerces.
And that's xerces.org.
That's right.
Perfect. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/feedthebees. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Greg Peterson here, and I want to thank you for listening to the Urban Farm Podcast. We wouldn't be able to keep doing these great shows without you. So as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you access to a list of our top 10 episodes I personally find most inspiring. If you enjoy the Urban Farm Podcast but don't have time to listen to every one, then you will love this list. Although all our guests have great information to offer, if you are short on time, These 10 are must-listens. To get access to the top 10 most inspiring podcast episodes, text FARMER to 44222. That's FARMER to 44222. And enjoy listening.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.